Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 40. Today we're discussing the two Natoma vineyards. They were close to each other in both time and distance, enough so that they've fooled wine historians much smarter than myself. They fooled me too. I have Kevin Knauss helping me today, though. He was the one to set me straight. He spent years as a historian studying the American River and Sacramento area, and has written about Bugbey and his Natoma vineyard, Ep40, Folsom Lake, the American River, and much more. You can find links to his books in the show notes. Our story today starts in the time and place of the California Gold Rush and concludes with it too. Although neither vineyard is well known today, they both had their time in the sun. They were run by real men of the age with all that entails. We'll hear about the first raisins made in California, one of the largest vineyards in the state, huge infrastructure projects, and the demise of both vineyards in the worst ways. We also get a return of Hillgard and the university experiment stations, finding what grapes will grow best in California. If you want to learn more about those, check out episodes 24 and 26 after. We'll talk about Benjamin Bugbey first. Kevin gives great descriptions about what people in general and winemakers or vineyardists were going through at the time, trying to find their way in this new land. Kevin also provides much useful information on the ways farmers at the time would learn of new technologies and techniques and how the sharing of information happened. I imagine in this way, Bugbey could kind of serve as a stand-in for many of the very early California vineyardists and winemakers. We then get to the other Natoma vineyard and we see the good and bad and horrible of when big business combines with vineyards. That music you hear was commissioned by Bugbey. Stick around at the end and you can hear some more. Here we go. Our setting today is the banks of the American River and its tributaries. It flows down from the Sierra Nevada mountains past Folsom before intersecting with the Sacramento River and flowing towards the Delta and the Bay. It's one of the most important rivers in California and has been for a long time. The South Fork is where gold was first discovered, and the forks of the river are still mined to this day. The Maidu people lived here along this river for millennia. The Miwok, Nisenan, and Winton lived here along the river as well. Salmon, trout, lamprey eel, and freshwater mussels are native to its waters. Insects, crickets, grasshoppers, quail, rabbits, and deer live on its banks. Natoma, which you will hear a lot today, is a Maidu word meaning clear water. But it was first applied by A.P. Catlin, giving the name to the Mormon Island post office. We'll meet him soon.
When I started doing research on the Natoma Water and Mining Company and what was underneath Folsom Lake, Bugbey's name kept cropping up. It's kind of an odd name, Bugbey. And then I started, researching. It's like, he's in the newspapers every year, sometimes multiple times per day, all the way through 1914 when he dies. I'm thinking, who was this guy? What happened? And so then that's when I really started doing some serious research, because Bugbey is talked about at the Folsom Historical Society and, kind of the celebrated vineyards and wines and whatnot. But it's just a small slice, an incredibly small slice of a man's life and what he went through and persevered. So that's when I really started digging deeper into it.
Benjamin Bugbey was a true 49er, landing in California right in the middle of the year, June 11th. Like most, he headed for the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. In his case, to the North Fork of the American River and its bustling gold fields.
He truly was a 49er, and I was not able to grab a lot of his early life in Connecticut. We do know that he was working in Quincy, Massachusetts, possibly at a mercantile store, but he had connections back in Connecticut because he grew up in Stafford County, and that's where kind of that Hamden mining company was formed. And so they shipped off in early January 1849 with a group of men. The whole plan was to get down to Brazos, Mexico, and then go over the peninsula there to Mazatlan and pick up a skip. But the Hamden Mining Company, like so many other mining companies, it kind of disintegrated, especially when it got into Mexico and everyone kind of broke off and went their different ways. The best recapitulation of that event is by, I think it's Asa Bennett, because he wrote a book on it. But he didn't go over to Mazatlan. He went up through the desert and almost died.
Here's a typical entry from Asa Bennett Clark on the day they arrived at Brazos, Mexico. February 18th. In the morning, we came up off Brazos, but the wind and waves were so high that we were obliged to keep away from shore. This is a dangerous coast, and many vessels have been lost here. There is a dangerous bar before the place, and only small craft can pass it in good weather. But when it's rough, it is dangerous for any steamboat or vessel. We consequently cruised back and forth by Brazos all day with a high sea." Unquote.
Bugbey and some of the other gentlemen, Israel Luce and James McClatchy, they got over to Mazatlan and finally got up to San Francisco and got into San Francisco in 1849. A fairly, arduous trek. And that's what kind of pulled a lot of the 49ers together, was that shared experience, that common experience of getting to California. It was pretty arduous.
Also, like most, he found that mining maybe wasn't for him and switched to some other professions like running a mercantile store, then a hotel, and by 1853, a furniture business. Granite Township was the forerunner to the town of Folsom, and Bugbey thought it might be a good place to farm. This is from Kevin's book, setting the scene of the American river Bugbey would find. Quote, "The light from the rising sun over the Sierra Nevada mountains made the inside of the white canvas tent glow. A young Benjamin Norton Bugbey woke up on a warm summer morning to the sounds of the American River flowing below his camp. On the opposite side of the river, to his left was Mormon Island, and to his right was Beals Bar. He had staked his tent on a flat spot above the confluence of the North Fork and the South Fork of the American River. It was the summer of 1849, and Bugbey had only arrived in California a few months earlier. The morning melody was a collage of different dialects and languages from people all over the world. The sound of gold mining rockers could be heard working in the American River below. There was a sense of industriousness as the miners set about to find their fortunes in the riverbed. They had come to California for an adventure, to find their treasure, and hopefully to get rich. These young, ambitious men, with whom Bugbey would include himself, set up their crude living facilities among the Native American Nisenan people, who already called the region their home." Unquote.
So Bugbey comes to California and goes up to kind of the Mormon Island areas where a lot of the gold action was happening. I don't want to call him a loner, but he was kind of an independent fella. And he was involved with some mining companies and whatnot, but he kind of did his own mining stuff through 1849 and worked at various jobs. I don't know how much gold he actually was able to come away with, but he kept at it. And then there was, below the confluence of the South and North Forks of the American River, what would become known as Folsom, and he started doing some mining there, not at the river level, but up above on the bench. Most of the landscape in that area is the cobble rock. It's, river wash. So they were boring into the hillside and pulling out all the big cobble rocks, and then they would take the dirt and they would wash it. And that actually went on for many years. And but what is interesting is that Bugbey pursued that for a while, and I'm not really exactly sure what happened, but in 1851, he went back to Connecticut and married Jane. Wells was her last name, and brought her out to California. And that's when his life really kind of begins, and then you start seeing more of his name in the newspapers beginning in 1853. He opens up a furniture store in Sacramento, and, some people say it kind of collapsed because of the floods and the fires, but I never read where that affected him. I just think it just didn't work. And then he went out, the Coloma Road, he went out that way and managed the Monte Cristo Hotel. And what really kind of set off like, whoa, whoa, this is interesting. I was doing some research over at UC Davis and came across a map. And it happened to be the map of the Rio Rancho de los Americanos land grant to Williams Leidesdorf. But up in this one little area where the American River makes a curve, it said Bugbey's farm. I think, is that the same Bugbey? Started doing some other research. Sure, yes, he had a farm there, or he was farming, at least in 1854, 1855. And of course, the Sacramento Valley Railroad is coming online, and it's going from Sacramento up to Granite City. Theodore Judah had laid out a town. So things were moving forward with this new little town to be developed. And when Captain Folsom died, they rechristened the town Folsom in his honor because he had taken over the Leidesdorf land grant. But Bugbey sees an opportunity in a new community. He also was sued for lack of payment on this property or maybe some material he bought for the farm. So it was kind of like, he wasn't making money in farming either. But Sacramento County had split that area up. At the time, the county was broken up into what they called townships, little administrative units that would have a constable, a justice of the peace, and, in the outlying areas that they would be administering, the misdemeanors and minor infractions. And so Bugbey goes up there, he buys some lots that have been released in the city of Folsom, and he runs for constable, and he's elected. So it's like, wow, okay, his law enforcement career has started. And he has some success in law enforcement. And of course, he has some celebrated achievements where he rounds up the Tom Scott Bell gang or something like that in a big shootout. And so he was garnering some press attention from his attempts to kind of clean up the area that was, it's still Wild West back then. He was credited with saving the life of a man who was going to be lynched by some people in Brighton Township because he had allegedly committed a murder. So we're getting a sense of this ethical individual, kind of law and order, but a hard worker as well. And he parlays his constable position to running for the sheriff of Sacramento County and wins. At that time in Sacramento County, like most other counties, the sheriff was also the tax collector. And so the sheriff would go out and make rounds. It would be published in the paper, Sheriff Bugbey is going to be at Daler Ranch or this location. You can come and pay your property tax. And so that's one of the things the sheriff did, was collect the taxes. The sheriff also got a commission he got to keep a portion of what he collected. So there was some incentive to maximize the tax collections. And in one of those, there was the foreign miners tax. And Bugbey went up to a Chinese mining camp up above Mormon Island. And I don't have all the reports, but it sounded like he kind of busted up some stuff because the Chinese refused to pay the foreign miners tax. They said they weren't in Sacramento County. And Bugbey was sued by the Chinese miners for $10,000. And come to find out, they were in El Dorado County. This is the area that would become the Natoma Vineyard.
Bugbey moved near to what would become his Natoma Vineyard in the 1860s.
I can't say that is where Bugbey met, it was James Hardesty that he eventually purchased the property from, but it was right in that area of Browns Ravine in El Dorado County. In 1863, he makes the purchase and, he's still sheriff, but obviously Bugbey, he may have grown up on a farm, but he always did like agriculture. And we see that later on in his life when he owned a farm called Kirkville up in Sutter County that did very well. So he really liked working with the earth and producing something of an agricultural product. And of course, Hardesty already had some wine grapes on there. And so, Bugbey kind of just kept going. I don't know if he knew what he was going to do with the property, but, he was intrigued by it. Bugbey runs for sheriff again, but is branded a copperhead by James McClatchy, one of the men he came to California with and had become the owner of the Sacramento Bee at that time. And that was successful enough that Bugbey did not get the nomination, and McClatchy actually did win in his effort to become the sheriff of Sacramento County. But Bugbey kind of took it in stride. He goes, I think in the back of his mind, he goes, well, I got this land. I got what I'm going to be calling the Natoma Vineyard. And that's where he really started putting his energy into building up the Natoma Vineyard and started doing grapes, or not, vineyards, obviously, but raisins.
By 1863, he was producing raisins on his 44-acre vineyard. He was the pioneer raisin maker in the state of California. Described as, quote, the only man in the state engaged in this business extensively, unquote. The Fahir Zagos is the grape most closely associated with Bugbey. It's described as, quote, an oblong, green, or light amber grape, below medium size with vines of most robust growth and prodigious bearers. They make a small but very good raisin, especially for cooking purposes, unquote. I was totally unfamiliar with this grape, and there isn't a ton of info about it, but it appears the name translates to odorous or smelly white. I guess it could be an aromatic white type. Foundation Plant Services says it means Muscat Blanc. It's known as Azerjo usually in Europe. FPS does have one selection that came from its Davis vineyard, and they have chosen to keep the Fahir Zagos name for historical reasons. Most likely Bugbey is among those reasons. The only analysis I found shows that it has a very high pH and extremely low TA, even at a fairly low Brix. It is vitis vinifera, but it seems like the wine would probably be pretty flabby. The Fahir Zagos was thought even at the time to be the same grape as the Larga Malaga or Bloom Raisin or some other known grapes, but it's possible that it was a unique Hungarian grape. As we know, stopping the misidentification of foreign grapes was one of the University of California's reasons for starting the experiment stations. This wouldn't be the first or last grape that was misidentified. Bugbey would dry the raisins near the vineyard, constructing a wooden frame and then placing wood laths over it, making a grid and placing a wicker over that. From there, straw would be laid down and the ripe bunches placed in the sun. After 10 days, they would be flipped, naturally flattening once they were. Mosquito bars, which were like screen doors, would be placed over the grapes to protect them from birds. In 1863, Bugbey made 1,000 pounds, and by 1865, he was up to 5,000 pounds of raisins. The Natoma vineyard at the time had 32,000 vines, and his Duroc vineyard had 17,000. They were a hit, with the current vintage arriving 4 to 6 months ahead of the imported versions, giving Bugbey an instant jump on the competition, of which foreign was the only kind at the time.
Bugbey was quite the marketer, and there wasn't a lot of pomology, scientific knowledge back then in crop identification. And somehow he identified a vine, a grape, as Fahir Zagos. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly or not. But he took it and ran with it as being an excellent grape that could be turned into a raisin or a white wine. And he just kind of ran with it because no one really said, what are you talking about? What is this grape? And he was growing all these different grapevines and whatnot. But it was a pomologist, I believe out of Utah, that said that there's no such thing. This is what we call white romaine or something like that. And that this grape has just been promoted by this gentleman Bugbey, for his own purposes. So it was interesting that after that came out in about 1868, Bugbey does drop reference to the Fahir Zagos, and also the California Farm Journal drops using it as a reference. And I think they start calling it the White Romaine or the White Malmsey or something like that. And, Bugbey didn't, I never really, in reading through his stuff, that he took offense. It's like, oh, okay, all right, whatever. We'll just kind of move forward. Because I'm not sure if any of these grapes were properly identified. But yeah, it was kind of interesting. He was using that as marketing in his cuttings and whatnot to promote viticulture in the state of California. So we all make mistakes, I suppose. Back then, you just didn't have a book that you could pull out of your back pocket and compare an illustration of a leaf, because until the berries come on and there's fruit, that's the way you're going to identify, is by a leaf. And then you can also identify by the berries and the color. But how many of even the books today, I mean, they just weren't available. So if someone misidentifies something, I can't hold them too guilty, especially in the 1860s.
The Natoma ditch was in the southeastern portion of his vineyard. The vineyard itself being in a bit of a low-lying land or a hollow. A creek ran through it as well. The soil had quartz, slate, and granite throughout. The depth was 6 inches to 3 feet on this poor soil. Here's a little more about the Zagos. Quote, "A good grape for this purpose is one of the many Malaga varieties, but a Hungarian grape, Zagos, is preferred. The raisins from this are of a light red color and white bloom, of medium size with a thin skin, tender pulp and seed, and a pure, sweet flavor, free from musky taste. This grape was brought from Hungary in 1853, and from 2 small cuttings have sprung 50,000 bearing vines and some 300,000 cuttings and roots. It is a prolific bearer and averages in 6 years 30 to 40 pounds to the vine. The vine is usually trimmed, like the other vines in California, as a tomato bush, the main stalk some 18 inches above the ground. The young wood is staked up about 4 feet high, and the runners pinched in during the summer so as to throw out lateral shoots and thus protect the fruit from the rays of the sun by the leaves." Unquote. Others described it as, quote, "It possesses the advantage of having a thin skin, few seeds, is easily dried, has a good flavor, and is very productive. On the other hand, its small size unfits it for table fruit. There is little doubt, however, that it will continue to be a favorite cooking raisin." Unquote. And George West, the pioneering grower of Stockton, added, quote, "It makes a small, delicate raisin which can never sell for a high price, but still is very sweet and productive. It will ripen early, has been cured in 12 days, and might be made to pay quite as well as a grape of higher grade that requires more time and effort to perfect." Unquote. 7 to 10 tons an acre of yield was common. Bugbey was learning how to make raisins, but also teaching others how to make them and promoting the greatness of vineyards and grapes for raisins and wine and brandy in the state. By 1865, he was making wine and brandy also. Bugbey would let the grapes shrivel on the vine a little bit before picking for wine, thinking it improved quality if not quantity. He used all redwood fermenters for the 8,000 gallons of wine made in 1865. Quote, "A part of which is fermented in the pulp and skins in large redwood vats containing 1,000 gallons each, and a part is made by pressing out the juice and fermenting that in the vats separate from the skin and pulp." Unquote. He also made 1,000 gallons of brandy that year using mostly second crop grapes. The cellar was built into a hillside for insulation and made of slate that was found in the vineyard. The walls were 2 feet thick with a poured cement floor and heavy fireproof iron door. The cellar was 18 by 54 feet and 18 feet high and held 2 1,400-gallon redwood casks, an oak one of 1,010 gallons, and numerous smaller casks. We believe he still had a large number of varieties in the vineyard at this time, though he reportedly planned to narrow it down to 12. And I'm using the names given in the literature at the time here: Flaming Tokay, Black Zinfandel, Red Traminer, Pinot, Alicante, Johannesburg Riesling, White Tokay, White St. Peter's, Fahirzagos, Grey Riesling, Verdelho, and others. At the California State Agricultural Fair of 1866, he submitted 19 wines, most from the so-called foreign grapes. That was shorthand for basically anything but mission. These were all white, red, or sparkling. Wines were fermented in 800-gallon vats and then aged in 40-gallon casks and redwood pipes. He would prepare his redwood casks, of which he had many, by steaming them, then soaking them in salt water, and then giving them a good wash in order to remove the coloring and flavor that they could leach into the wine. The wines from this year are described as, quote, "They are scarcely more than a year old, but are described as having a fine flavor and sufficient body to warrant the belief that with age they must acquire a much higher character and value," unquote. Bugbey noted a process he used of concentrating his wines by dry heat. It seemed to work to good effect based on the metals he was winning. He would hold the wines at 160 degrees for about 40 days, always experimenting with the winemaking process. He called the wines rich and mellow and ready for market after this heat treatment. That year he made 72 barrels of it, storing it with Leland Stanford, governor at the time.
Libraries just weren't all over the place, and there wasn't a lot of written material. The Mechanics Institute down in San Francisco, that's what their role was the library. And so they had the library of all kinds of the latest, greatest, scientific journals and different contraptions and things being put together. So that's where you went to kind of learn about how to do something, how to build something new, see what was the new technology. So Bugbey got involved with the Mechanics Institute early on to help learn about how people were doing raisins and wine and all the different things that went into it. So he was kind of an entrepreneurial individual. He was kind of mechanically minded. I think he liked that challenge. And so he ran with raisins to start generating some dollars and then started making wine through that. And at the time that he bought what would become the Natoma Vineyard, he also made the purchase of the Duroc Vineyard over in Shingle Springs. The nice thing about the Duroc Vineyard is that it did have water available to it through the Eureka ditch, and it was close to what was being built as the Folsom to Placerville Railroad. So you had a rail line there. The Natoma Vineyard was about 4 miles away from Folsom, so there was still kind of some hauling issues to get wine and everything to Folsom to then be shipped down to Sacramento and beyond. But Duroc was a little bit nicer area. But he always promoted everything around the Natoma Vineyard and just, kind of really fell in love. That he was still involved in politics, but he was really putting his energy into building up the Natoma Vineyard and getting the grapevines. He learned how to propagate grapevines, which you just lay one on the ground and it'll propagate itself. They just grow. But he was experimenting with these different cuttings and seeing what worked and what didn't work.
The Duroc Vineyard at this time was 20 acres with 15,500 vines, 11,500 of the, quote, foreign varieties. We don't have as much info about it, unfortunately. It seems as though it was used as a vineyard source for Bugbey, but everything was marketed under the Natoma name. I think it's safe to assume he would have had many of the same types of grapes planted at the Duroc Vineyard as he did at Natoma. We know he produced raisins from the vineyard as early as 1864, but after this it kind of recedes into the background and the Natoma Vineyard comes to the forefront. Bugbey had built a house on the Natoma Vineyard land as well as a distillery and winery, but he would build a newer home on a hill above the vineyard, expanding the operation in every way.
So he was involving that. He took out a loan early on, mortgaged the property to expand, and was, building the storage areas and the winery operations. He was importing more and more casks, wooden casks, to age the wine in. So he really was involved in it and going fairly strong.
Advertisements show Bugbey selling cuttings in 1867 of, quote, foreign grape cuttings. It's also noted that they're, quote, truly named. We know that wasn't always the case then. It's not always the case now even.
If he had a genius, it was in marketing. And if he had any real weak spot, it was in financial acumen sometimes. He couldn't see into the future. He wasn't good at planning that aspect of it. But on the marketing side, he was good. He was always, even when he was a sheriff, he was bringing the Sacramento Union, which was the favorite newspaper and supported him. He'd bring him raisins, he'd bring him grapes, he'd bring him wine. He was taking that over to the California Farm Journal and the Rural Press. And so he was always cultivating these relationships with the newspapers because those were the primary means of which anyone learned of anything that was happening. And of course, he started taking out advertisements in those newspapers. And Bugbey was, he was acquainted with a lot of people. He knew Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford actually signed one of the deeds when he bought some additional land from the Central Pacific Railroad at the Natoma Vineyard. And James Anthony was Freeman, the Mason. He was in the Masons. James Anthony owned the Sacramento Union. So he knew a lot of these men. They were kind of 49ers. And he did become a member of the Pioneer Society in Sacramento, but he wasn't really very active. He was a member of the International Order of Odd Fellows and of the Masons, but he wasn't super duper active in those organizations. He was more active in politics, and so that's kind of where he put his interest in terms of that and different the agricultural committees. He eventually got involved with the Vineyard and Wine Growers Association. So that's kind of where he was putting his energy. He seemed to be having fun, growing these different vines, and making some wine and experimenting with it, and doing the raisins. At one point later on in life, he even kind of reflects. He goes, if I had to do it all over, I'd probably just stick with raisins because they were more profitable.
Bugbey, along with some of his fellow vineyardists and winemakers, sent examples of their wines to the Agricultural Department in Washington in 1866. They also sent soil samples from the vineyards that could be analyzed at the department, showing that even in this early year of California agriculture, soil was a concern. Bugbey sent 9 samples of wine and 1 of brandy. His Benny Carlo was fermented on skins for 10 days for color and aroma. The rest of the samples were fermented as juice in casks. These were his White Muscat, White Malaga, Black Zinfandel, spelled Zuifindol in this case, White Riesling, White Pinot, but maybe this is supposed to be Pinot, I'm not quite sure, and Red Traminer. The Natoma Vineyard had 48,000 vines on its 56 uneven acres at this time. Quote, "Not one rod of level land is contained in the vineyard. The soil is very shallow. The bedrock is of slate and stands vertically," unquote. Bugbey noted he used some of the table and raisin grapes in certain wines also.
Bugbey kept going and entering his wine in different competitions and got, various medals from the state fairs and Mechanics Institute. He was shipping wine back east. I think he sent something to the World Exposition, because there was a mention of that going out of San Francisco. So he was really trying to promote his wines.
A massive fire broke out at the winery, destroying 12,000 gallons of wine and damaging buildings. Suspecting it was arson, Bugbey put out a $500 reward that went unclaimed.
Now, yes, Bugbey did suffer from fires, as many people did. In 1866, I believe there was a fire at his winery, and he did advertise a reward for the capture of the arsonist. And I don't think anyone was ever caught how that happened, why he thought it was arson, and I'm not entirely certain. There was nothing really given in the details about that.
Bugbey had another large issue when he neglected to register his property or the title to the land. Because of the Natoma ditch that ran through it prior to his purchase and a zoning issue with a section set aside for schools, Bugbey ended up in a long, drawn-out, and expensive court battle that lasted 12 years starting about 1868.
But getting back to this whole land ownership, and that's the crazy thing to a certain extent. Go back and see these deeds, Bugbey buys this property in 1863 from James Hardesty, and he files the meets and bounds description of this property, but he didn't own it. He couldn't, because it had not been mapped by the federal government. And until the land was mapped by the public land survey system, the townships and the ranges, only then could it be offered for sale. And if a gentleman or anyone had improved the property, they could file a preemption to then acquire that land so it wasn't sold to somebody else. You could file a preemption that, hey, you got first right of refusal. What was interesting about Bugbey's property, the Natoma Vineyard, is it was in Section 16. And Section 16 and 36 of the townships, and these sections are 1 mile by 1 mile, were set aside for the state to sell to raise money for schools. So Bugbey could have filed a preemption when the maps were released. He didn't. He let the land go to the state of California, and then he officially bought the property from the state of California. So he bought the land twice, essentially. And this was the hinge for his case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court over the taking of his property by the Natoma Water and Mining Company. Congress had passed an act on July 26, 1867, that stated that when water canals and ditches crossed public lands, the owner of that ditch could claim ownership of, I don't know how wide, but they could claim ownership of that. The state of California came into the ownership of the property in May of 1866. That happened before the act was passed, and then Bugbey bought the property 2 months before the 1867 purchase, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to go back and check my dates. But essentially, there was no claim by the Natoma Water and Mining Company on the property because it was owned by the state of California, who then sold it to Bugbey. And that's how he kind of came into possession of it, or how he won the case, I should say. But it is interesting how these imaginary lines are laid down across land, rivers, and that decided the fate of so many people. And of course, the Native Americans didn't even have a say in it. I picked up a book, the California Register from 1857, an original copy that I paid too much for, but I had to have it. But there is in there a statement from the gentleman who is running the Indian reservations in California, and he notes that, he was, keeping the Indians on, these 5 or 6 different reservations, and that he was making sure that they were never able to lay any claim to the land in California. Now, the ditch that meandered through there, and that leads into part of Bugbey's problems, the Natoma Water and Mining Company, they wanted to haven't really figured out if they just wanted to build a flume or improve a flume that was there. It sounds from the research that they wanted to build a flume over Brown's Ravine, which was across Bugbey's property. Now, these water ditches pretty much followed the elevation of the hillside. So if there was a ravine, it had to go up the ravine and come back down. And they had to keep a certain slope to keep the water flowing. And sometimes just moving up those creeks, just things slowed down. So a flume would be better adapted to keep the water flowing. Bugbey kind of protested of the taking of his property. And that went to court, and it was decided that the Natoma Water and Mining Company should compensate him $19,000 for the taking of acreage of his planted vineyard. That litigation would continue, and they would never pay him, at least while he was in business.
This outstanding money, it would be around $700,000 today, would come back to haunt Bugbey. He would be in search of money and additional ways to earn it, becoming an agricultural commissioner the next year. But bad luck seemed to be following Bugbey during this time in his life. His wife died of injuries sustained in a tragic fall while on horseback in 1869.
He did suffer when Mary Jane, his wife, was killed in a riding accident going from the Natoma Vineyard to Mormon Island to pick up a coach to go into Folsom. And she essentially kind of fell off a horse, but her leg was caught and her head hit a rock. And so that hurt, and because they had been married for many years, and that was a big loss. Now, he did remarry shortly thereafter to Martinette McClashen, who was the daughter of Peter McClashen, who I believe may have worked at the Natoma Vineyards. I do know that he did work in some vineyards over in Sonoma and Napa counties. So he marries Nettie, and things kind of go on from there. And then his house on the hill burns down, and that was purely an accident. I think a neighbor had a burn pile, got out of control with some high winds, and he estimated that house cost between $30,000 and $40,000 to build. So that was a financial hit.
Bugbey pressed on, expanding his distilling operation with the help of the Johnson still. It was a new invention that was said to drive off the fusel oils much more quickly, allowing brandy to be brought to market sooner and at a lower cost, even before taking into account cooperage costs. You would get 20% more spirits and 25% less cost. By 1867, he was making 30,000 pounds of raisins, 17,000 gallons of wine, and 3,000 gallons of brandy. Bugbey started making champagne in 1868 and lost $12,000 that first year. Within 3 years, he felt he was on the right track and making 4,800 cases a year.
And that's when 1868 is when the Johnston still came on. And this is where the Mechanics Institute would really come in, because you had to build this complicated still of getting the crushed pumice, and then getting that up to temperature and going through all the tubes and everything. It must have been just incredible to watch that happen. And now there was a patent on this process, but Johnston wasn't selling a contraption. He was just selling the rights to build it. And so that's what Bugbey invested in, but he had to pay to have it built. So there was an expense to bring that up to order, and so that it was actually producing brandy, which some people felt was good. Of course, getting into sparkling wine and brandy was a larger leap of mechanical engineering. At one point, he mentions that he spent over $12,000 just trying to figure out how to do the champagne to make a drinkable product. And then he invested heavily in the Johnston brandy still. Its claim to fame was to remove the fusel oil, and there was some sort of acetic ether or something. I don't know. I don't know much about brandy. Somehow, when you took it through the Johnston still, within 3 months, you had a sellable product. In 1870, he was producing, they say, about 60,000 gallons of wine. That had dropped considerably later on in the 1870s. On brandy, he was producing about 4,000 gallons and about 8,000 by 1871.
Bugbey was also appearing in the viticultural journals at the time. He's referenced along with John Strentzel, who we met in episode 35, on the best way to plant vines. Bugbey would plant 2 cuttings per hole, pulling out the weaker-looking one at the end of the year. Strentzel didn't plant vines like this, but they did both agree on how to best lay out a vineyard on an 8x8 grid using perpendicular rows and planting at the intersections. The Bugbey wines were getting out into the wider world also. He would ship his wines to New York, sometimes sending 10 carloads or 20,000 gallons by railroad.
You know, it's one thing to be a vineyard owner, and you grow your grapes, you cut them, you sell them someplace else. It's an entirely different proposition to own a vineyard and then kind of vertically integrate raisins. You're taking that grape and you're converting it into a product. And of course, you have to change the product so that you can sell from grape to raisin. And that takes a little bit of know-how on how you're going to get to that point, packaging it. Wine is a whole other, I don't think people understand what goes into winemaking. It is just not just pulling, grapes off the vine and, crushing them. I mean, there's all kinds of steps that are involved, crushing them, fermenting them, getting into bottles and whatnot. And Bugbey really kind of liked that challenge of learning how to do that and make it happen. And I think that was part of his early success. I remember reading in one of the commentaries on the wine, seems odd to us, but it noted it was clear. Clear? I mean, when is wine not clear? Well, depending on the vintner, you may get cloudy wine, depending on how they were filtering it. So obviously he had figured out how to filter the wines fairly well to produce something that looked good, because wine not only needs to taste and smell good, it needs a certain presentation.
We have some great descriptions and notes of the vineyard in 1870. The entire estate the vineyard sat on was 480 acres, with 125 acres under vine. 88 of those were bearing fruit, and the rest only a year or two behind. Mission was being grown here, which was a given, but also white Malaga. The vines being described as a mess of grapes, 40 to 75 pounds per vine was the yield. The red Traminer, quote, also an immense crop, a mass of rich, compact clusters, unquote. Zinfandel, Verdelho, Pinot, Alicante, and Johannesburg Riesling were all said to have a splendid, heavy crop. Chasselas, Muscadine, Black Muscat, Black Malvasia, Black Prince, White and Gray Riesling, and Sweetwater were Bugbey's other wine grape varieties. Flame Tokay, White Tokay, Cannon Hall Muscat, Rose de Peru, White St. Peter's, Palestine, and White Nice were table grapes. This year is expected to yield 125,000 gallons of wine and 8,000 gallons of brandy. He had 69 standing casks that held 800 gallons each, 20 tanks that were 1,000 gallons each, and was awaiting an additional 20 tanks to be delivered that would add another 110,000 gallons of storage. Making the Bugbey wine was clearly something he took pride in. He would make port, sherry, red and white wines, hock, and chambertin. 25 men would work year-round for Bugbey, making wine and brandy and tending the vineyard. During harvest time, he would hire an additional 40 men, of which 25 were Chinese, mostly to work in the vineyards. Bugbey noted, quote, in the manufacture of the wines at this vineyard, the greatest care is paid to the preparation and purity of the casks, the buildings being light, airy, and warm. The casks are more exposed to light and heat, and therefore are of the best kind, purely light and sweet. The poor soil quality of Bugbey's vineyard was noted and how it could produce fine grapes. He thought red Traminer was his highest quality wine, while Zinfandel was the most productive vine. In 1871, Bugbey would pay $25 a ton for grapes delivered to his Duroc vineyard and its Shingle Springs winery, and $50 a ton for grapes delivered to his Folsom winery, or Natoma. In 1871, he won awards for his sweet wines, getting recognition alongside George West, Matthew Keller, Eberhardt and Lachman, and other outstanding winemakers of the age. He also won for his Zinfandel, Red Burgundy, and Riesling. At this 1871 fair, he exhibited the following grapes: Malaga, Muscatel, Pinot, Black Hamburg, Isabella, Chasselas, Blue Malvasia, Flaming Tokay, Catawba, Feherzagos, Orleans, Johannesburg Riesling, Frontignan, Black Zinfandel, Red Traminer, Pride of Paris, Sarian, White Palestine, White Muscat of Alexandria, Queen of Nice, and Alicante. In his acceptance for 1871, he mentions the brandy was all distilled using the Johnson still and that only burnt sugar was added for color. The wines were all naturally fermented except for the port and chambertin, and, quote, they were subjected to 200 degrees Fahrenheit for the space of 30 days in a closed tank, holding over 10,000 gallons and concentrated 1/5. The port was placed on and subjected to heat 60 days after it had been drawn from the fermenting tub where it was first fermented on the pulp and skins. The chambertin was treated in a like manner. All the wines I placed on exhibition were fermented on the pulp and skins, unquote. Others took note of his vineyard as well. Quote, situated in the hills at the very base of the Sierras and within sight of the snow-covered heights, the Feherzagos variety is the one that has been most successful in this locality, and Mr. Bugbey is of the opinion that it is the best raisin grape that can be raised in California. Later in 1871, fire struck again, this time at Connor's Flowering Mill, which Bugbey had purchased to use as a storehouse in Folsom. It was 3 stories of brick, the top story rented for society meetings. Bugbey was underinsured for the $85,000 in damage and the loss of wine.
Then in 1871, there was a fire in Folsom. And Bugbey had acquired some property that was an old flouring mill. It was 3 stories tall, and he used the bottom for storage of his wines. And I think he lost a lot of inventory. They said he might have been insured for $12,000 or $19,000. But what was interesting in some of the letters that I found between 2 brothers, Nathaniel and Ambrose Knight, the first one said, oh, yeah, well, talk around Folsom is that it was, the fire was started by one of those muck-a-muck Freemason guys. Well, Bugbey was a Freemason. In the return letter, the other brother says, well, yeah, the gossip around town is that Bugbey started the fire to collect on the insurance. I don't know. That, if he was in that kind of a pinch, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You would like to think someone wouldn't do that because it burned a lot of other people's property, but can't completely rule it out. No one was ever caught. No one was ever prosecuted for it.
In 1872, Bugbey joined the California Wine Growers and Wine and Brandy Manufacturers Association. He was vice president and on the boards of the Cultivation of the Grape and Pruning of the Vine Committee and the On Winemaking and Clarification of Wine Committee. Here are a few of the other prominent winemen he was on the board or committees with: George West, Joel Clayton, William McPherson Hill, L.J. Rose, John Strentzel, and Arpad Harasti. He was in good company, and many of these men we've already learned about or will soon. The association was started to help small growers learn how to better take care of their vineyards, produce their wines and brandies better, learn how to market it, and also as a trade organization to try and lobby Congress. First on their lobbying list was getting the taxes removed on brandy that was made from grapes. Ever the marketer, Bugbey held a dance inside his 50,000-gallon wine tanks. They danced in, quote, the old Bavarian style while a band played. While some danced, there was room for another 20 spectators, plus musicians inside the tank. He also won awards for brandy at the same 1874 exhibition, and awards for Best Brandy 1870, White Wine 1873, and Red Wine 1872 at the California State Agricultural Society. Some of the wines Bugbey was entering at the time: Burgundy, 1 year old; California, 1 year old; Burgundy Port, 2 years old; Red Burgundy, 3 years old; Red Burgundy, 2 years old; White Wine, 1 year old; California Sherry; Port; 2 bottles Muscatel Brandy, 2 years old; 2 bottles Grape Brandy, 3 years old; 2 bottles of Grape Brandy, 4 years old. In 1874, Bugbey expected to make 8,000 gallons of brandy and 125,000 gallons of wine. Notably, he mentioned using no irrigation at all. We do know the Natoma ditch was unlined, so water would seep through the ground, giving an extra boost to what was planted nearest.
The Natoma ditch ran above most of the vineyard, and I believe the reports that he irrigated the vines, 3 times a year. I think at one point he mentioned just once a year. But part of it, the Natoma ditch was carrying quite a bit of water, was not lined. It was just earthen. So there was seepage down below. So I think some of the orchards and the vineyards were actually surreptitiously irrigated by subterranean water seeping out of the ditch. And how much that played in this projection, I'm not sure. But it was a nice area.
Bugbey wines were now being shipped all over to Chicago, New York City, and upstate New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Boston, St. Louis, and more. But at times it was just not enough. He was never the best with money. With financial pressure and debts mounting from all over, the Natoma Vineyard was sold at auction in Placerville in 1973. It was listed as having 100,000 vines planted on 155 acres out of 473. It also had 500 feet of frontage on the American River.
So things are drying up. His Natoma Vineyard is foreclosed on. There's some issues with that foreclosure, and one of the things Bugbey did learn from his time as the sheriff was he learned a lot about the law and how things worked in the judicial system and how to write up appeals and protests and whatnot. So sometimes he would act as his own attorney by writing things to the judge, to try and get things forestalled and whatnot. And of course, the issue with the Natoma Water and Mining Company taking his property, those acreage, they had still not paid him. And of course, that was still going through litigation. And he really needed that $19,000 by then. He actually turned over the management of the Natoma Vineyard to 2 employees for like $1,000. He was starting to sell property in Folsom. At one point, it looked like he was going to start mining again underneath the streets of Folsom, going to do some gold mining. But, he's in his late 40s by then. It's like everything is crumbling around him. And in 1877, the property is foreclosed on, and he loses most of the Natoma Vineyard. His wife at the time is able to kind of salvage the home they bought from C.T.H. Palmer in Folsom. She's able to come up with, $2,000 and whatnot. Where that money came from, who knows? I think probably a lot of men back there, had a stash of gold, dust or coin someplace that they wouldn't admit to. So he was able to stay, but the foreclosure and just the collapse of his vineyard. And I think we also have to remember that for most individuals, men and women, but particularly men, our identities are wrapped up in what we built. So to lose something like that is to lose an identity. And he did start drinking more. And he kind of went off the deep end in 1877 and busted up his home. Nettie had gone to Truckee to visit her brother, and she wasn't at home, but he thought she had left him because he wasn't very nice to her. So, he's creating a ruckus at this very nice home. The Palmer home was a nice home there in Folsom. And, neighbors call out, the constable comes out, and, Bugbey is just drunk and fires off a shot from his pistol and grazes the head of the constable and fires off a couple more shots. But, he's kind of just all over the place. And the constable is able to arrest him. And he gets down into the county jail where he used to be the sheriff, but now he is incarcerated. And he's just not lucid. He's just lost. He's just in a big fog as to what's going on, where he's at. He does have friends in law enforcement and other areas, and I think they counseled him to kind of leave Sacramento and Folsom at that point. And he does go down to San Francisco and picks up a job as, best I can tell, night watchman at the U.S. Mint. And in December of 77, it's noted in one of the newspapers that, he confesses sobriety at the gospel temperance movement. So he's going to swear off alcohol from that point forward.
Bugbey continued on in various pursuits, selling a better wagon axle and butter cooler. He was also remarried and again worked as a lawman and a tax collector too.
Now, part of the economic issues that Bugbey was facing through the 1860s, things were pretty good. Bugbey was in part a victim of his own success. He was selling grape cuttings, to other farmers, and promoting vineyards in general. He was big. He was telling everyone, hey, California, this is it. This is where we're going to be growing some superior grapes and turning them into quality wines. And so he was promoting everything throughout California. So he was selling all those grape cuttings. So there was more and more acreage being devoted to grapevines and grapes. And someone had to buy those grapes, right, to turn into wine, because there's more vineyards than there were winemakers. So he was promoting that front. He was also trying to, learn about, doing the champagne and the brandy. And after the Civil War, there was kind of an economic bump from Reconstruction. And so people did have money and they were spending, more or less freely. And Bugbey was shipping his product back east. But near the end of the 1860s, things started to slow down. Wine prices, finished wine product was pretty much staying flat. It wasn't inflating. So we had this kind of a slowdown in the economy. We had more grapes coming into the market and more wine coming into the market. And so there wasn't a big inflation that people could, vintners could, just get themselves out of debt with higher inflated prices of products. And Bugbey did have mortgages, and he didn't seem to have a lot of cash on hand. So then, the things really get tight, and he's having a tough time making mortgage payments because he had remortgaged the Natoma Vineyard. That went to the Pacific Mutual Life Company, I want to say for $20,000. And then things started to get even worse in the economy as things started to slow down in the 1870s. And in 1872, Congress demonetized silver, and that constricted the money supply. California was already very gold-centric. Most of the contracts were written that you would repay in gold. So that could be an issue. if you could not convert silver into gold. The greenbacks, dollars, paper money was also an issue. So if Bugbey was selling product to the East Coast, he was more than likely paid in dollars, and those were discounted. So he may only get 80 cents or 85 cents on the dollar when he converted it into gold. So that kind of shrunk in the conversion. And then when they demonetized silver, and then there was also the crash of the J. Cook banking house, we went into kind of a panic and a recession in 1873, and things really, really slowed down. So Bugbey just couldn't convert a lot of his product.
In 1877, with the financial pressure unbearable, Bugbey filed for bankruptcy.
And then later on in 1878, he gets word that the U.S. Supreme Court said, yeah, Bugbey was right. The Natoma Company took his property and they do owe him the money. Unfortunately, he had already transferred any money that may come as a result of the successful prosecution of the case to the attorney that had been handling. So he didn't see any of that, but he was able to gain his reputation back to a certain extent and then come back to Sacramento. The divorce with Nettie is final. They move some money around, and then shortly thereafter, he marries Julia Weibel, who is about 23 years his junior. Being Bugbey never had children, so he doesn't have a legacy in that regard, but he kind of comes back and no more winemaking, no more grapes. He goes back into law enforcement, and he kind of stays in Folsom for a while until he moves into Sacramento. So, yeah, it's kind of a tough story sometimes, but there are bright spots. Later on, he does, regain part of his life back. He's able to make a home for him and Julia. And there was no safety net back then. And so he had to find a way to earn a living. And he did, doing various things, real estate, insurance, selling butter coolers, all kinds of different things. So interesting story of perseverance. And even I never read that he ever drank alcohol again.
Bugbey never quite gave up his viticulturist dreams and was constantly experimenting, trying new inventions, and generally keeping an open mind. In 1885, he was attempting to concentrate fresh must, working with Mission, Zinfandel, Roussan, or Golden Chasselas as they called it, and for Zagos, concentrating them down to about 60 bricks. When the university released its Agricultural Experiment Station Bulletin number 54 that year, Bugbey gets a mention for using a Yaryan evaporator during the previous vintage. 60 tons of grapes were harvested and condensed down and shipped east to Toledo, Ohio, and the Lank Wine Company. They would ferment it both with some eastern grapes and by itself. The Viticultural Commission and the university tried it also. The university made a white wine from concentrated Zinfandel must. By all accounts from both sets of tests, the condensed must was very neutral and seemed to take on the aspects of any grape it was blended with, either before or after fermentation. Bugbey would defend his being the pioneer raisin maker in papers as late as the 1900s, writing, quote, "I was about 8 years ahead of R.B. Blowers in the raisin business. In fact, I had quit making raisins before Blowers commenced. I shipped raisin grape cuttings to all parts of the state and wrote essays on raisin making before others took hold of the enterprise." Unquote. Most of the Bugbey house and property is under the waters of Folsom Lake near Brown's Ravine. Kevin was able to locate some of the foundation in 2017 when the lake was at historic lows. Occasionally, if you catch it right, parts of the estate can still be seen. Bugbey passed away November 19th, 1914.
One of the things that attracted me to Bugbey and some of the other gentlemen that I had written about is that they came to California And they fell in love with it and decided to stay here. And for Bugbey, he even stayed in the area even after he had so many failures in his life and successes. And I live in the Sacramento region, grew up here, and so I kind of share the understanding of the climate and why someone would want to live in the area and call it home. Because there were many men that if they lived, they went back to the East Coast. They took their gold or whatever it was and went back to the East Coast. And, so you get older in life and you start reflecting. And you wonder, did I do my life right? Because I can't go back and do it over again. Where do I fit on the spectrum of success and failure? What kind of man was Bugbey like? And I really believe from everything, the reports, he was an affable, gregarious man. There were many reports that people would go to the Natoma Vineyard. He wouldn't let them leave without tasting his brandies and his wines, and some of them had a tough time climbing back up on the horse to get out of there. He was, I think he told one gentleman that it was great. He was involved in life insurance, and if he drank wine every day, his life would be extended. And of course, wine was medicinal, and he was selling his wine and brandy to the Sacramento County Hospital, upwards of $200 a month. So the doctors were really leaning on that as medicine for their patients. And this is where you really need to review an individual's life to really understand who they were. And in 1894, he writes this manifesto that he wants people to read. One of the things in the manifesto was that women should have the right to vote. But it was also very socialistic. And he called for limits on land ownership. I think 640 acres. No man should be able to own more than 640 acres because there were some land barons in California. He wanted grain silos, like community grain silos, put throughout the state. So if there was some sort of drought or famine, there would be crop there. So he was calling for all kinds of what we kind of take today as for granted, a social safety net. But women didn't have the right to vote. That was probably his big base, and so he didn't win on that.
As Kevin noted earlier, Bugbey was a marketer. His marketing didn't just stop at raisins or wines or brandies, butter coolers, or wagon axles. It extended to song. In 1870 and 1871, Bugbey debuted his Champagne Galop and Champagne Waltz, respectively. They were composed by a young German pianist Bugbey had seen perform in Sacramento.
To me, it's a misconception. You will read, Hugo Yankee was so taken by Bugbey Champagne that he wrote these pieces of music. And I never, ever found that anywhere. I think Bugbey, Mr. Marketing, decided that would be an excellent opportunity to market his products, was to have music written for them, because that was the primary entertainment back then, were concerts, and that's where people gathered. There were no movie houses, and obviously there was no internet. And so that was a good opportunity to support the arts and whatnot. And Hugo Yankee, he was a piano teacher. He played the organ for the Congregational Church. And he was developing, but of course he didn't have a ton of money. So I truly believe that Bugbey approached Yankee in probably 1868, 1869 and said, hey, would you like to write some music for me? And he did the two pieces, the Galop and the Waltz. The Galop is a more jaunty, almost the Galop doesn't, I don't think it has anything to do with a horse's gallop, but it is kind of, real danceable. And then, of course, the Waltz. Now, in I believe it was 1868, he did have some pictures taken of his vineyard by S.A. Todd out of Sacramento. And one of those is from the river looking south over his fields, and you can see some of the stone structures and his house up on the hill. And then the sheet music for the Bugbey Champagne Waltz is an illustration essentially of that photograph. And it gives a good idea of kind of the rolling hills where his vineyard was located, and it kind of straddled Brown's Ravine. In terms of geography and landscape, the vineyard was north facing, so it was on a slope that didn't get, it got warm, but it was kind of protected. So you didn't have super as harsh of conditions because it was south facing. The northern facing hills around there just gets baked by the sun, and you can't put enough water on anything to keep it alive during the summer. So that helped. Brown's Ravine was, some people called it a spring. I think it was just a creek that went through there, and that helped with some of the water. So overall, there was some irrigation in the area, relatively close to the river, but the soil was fairly shallow. So I just have to believe that there were some areas where the vines just wouldn't grow.
We'll move on to the other Natoma vineyard. This one is an entirely different story, yet related. The Natoma Water and Mining Company was started by A.P. Catlin in 1851 with 5 of his associates. He was a prominent resident of Mormon Island on the American River and would later become a Superior Court judge for Sacramento County. His background as a lawyer in New York before moving west also helped him to get elected to the state Senate. He was a true 49er like Bugbey. He and Bugbey knew each other, although didn't always agree. Perhaps Catlin's most lasting achievement was sponsoring the legislation to move the capital of California to Sacramento from Benicia.
Yeah, that's interesting because Catlin and Bugbey did know one another. A.P. Catlin came to California in 1849. He was an attorney by trade and passed the bar back in New York. When he came to California, it wasn't a state, and he did his mining, and he formed the Natoma Mining Company. And in the end of 1851, by 1851, most of the riverbed had been scoured out of the easy placer gold. And that's one of the things his company was involved in. So what they would do back in the early 1850s is they would build these dams along the river and divert the water so that they could get down to the bedrock, because that's where the placer gold was. And they employed steam shovels or steam engines, I apologize. And but one of the things Catlin saw was this diversion of water, but also now that most of the river gold was gone, the miners were turning their attention to the river banks, which was above the flow of the river, and they needed water. So we said, okay, well, this wasn't a new idea, but dam the river and run a canal and then drop the water, allow the water to flow down to the miners. So that's how you're going to make your money. So he got a group of gentlemen together and formed the Natoma Water and Mining Company, and they put a dam on the South Fork of the American River above Salmon Falls, and then ran a ditch, and it was engineered by A.T. Aerosmith, and it came down and supplied water through all along the South Fork. And then right before you get to Mormon Island, it exits the river canyon proper and then kind of goes over towards what would become Folsom and then down below. Catlin was also big in politics. He was elected a senator in 1852. He actually ran into his own money problems where he had to take out loans as he was prosecuting the construction of the ditch, and he was able to pull that together. Now, A.P. Catlin sponsored the legislation in 1854 to move the state capital from Benicia to Sacramento. That's one of his claims to fame. And so that happened in 1854. But he also got involved with the North Fork ditch on the North Fork of the American River and created the American River and Water and Mining Company over there. And in 1855, he was working to help build that. He was doing a lot of illegal stuff, but he was actually out there selling water, but also managing the flow and doing all the legal work involved with these ditches.
Horatio P. Livermore, although from Maine, like many other settlers of California, he came west in a wagon train leaving from Missouri. They were delayed in Salt Lake City due to Indian attacks for some time. But upon arriving in the goldfields, Livermore was interested in using a dam to power sawmills and to supply the growing town of Sacramento with wood. In 1853, when the Natoma Water and Mining Company opened up its stock to others, Livermore bought as much as he could afford. He would also go on to serve a term in the state Senate. William Leedersdorf, whose original land grant this took place on, was born on St. Croix in the Danish West Indies, now the U.S. Virgin Islands, in 1810. He was of Dutch descent on his father's side and African and Carib on his mother's. He became a successful sea captain sailing out of New Orleans, most likely the last black captain before it was outlawed. Arriving in Yerba Buena, now San Francisco, in 1841, he became an even more successful merchant, building the first hotel, operating the first steamship service, and a lumber yard. He was also active in city politics, serving on the first city council as the treasurer. Leedersdorf could speak 5 languages, Spanish among them, and after becoming a Mexican citizen, he was given the 35,000-acre Rancho Rio de los Americanos land grant. He unfortunately passed away in 1848 at the age of 37, one of the richest and most powerful men in San Francisco. Joseph Folsom eventually took over Leedersdorf's estate through some shady dealings and a court battle that concluded in 1855.
The Natoma Water and Mining Company, pretty much they have their canal down into Sacramento County. In the 1850s, most of California was public lands. So you could do anything you wanted. If you were strong enough, you could kick off other people, Native Americans, and build a dam, cut a trench. The only recognizable private property were the land grants. Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, and the U.S. had to recognize those as private property. And Catlin knew that some of his water canals crossed into the Rio Rancho de los Americanos land grant, which was then owned by Folsom, and there were going to be issues. And sure enough, the Folsom, essentially the Folsom estate, because Captain Folsom had died, said, you need to either pay us rent for crossing into our territory because you're on private property, or buy some land. And that's what Catlin had to do in 1857, as he bought 9,000 acres of the Leedersdorf land grant, which encompassed Folsom all the way down into what we know is Rancho Cordova, Gold River, a sizable chunk that would encapsulate all of where his water canals were going. And that was a huge, huge land purchase, and later on would spur the Natoma Company because they had all this land that they could, sell, and they would eventually grow wine grapes on that as well. There were issues with the boundaries of the land grant. Where were they? Most of the land grants had to go through the land commissioners, and they adjudicated and they set a map. At first, Catlin argued against the map that was drawn because too much of his canal was in there. But, he acquiesced. But there were some other issues that came up, and he had bought the land, and now he was kind of married to it. And essentially what happened is that he was appointed to lead the charge for the fight for the Leedersdorf land grant, Rio Rancho de los Americanos. and that would go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so he traveled back there in 1863 and argued before the U.S. Supreme Court for the map that it truly respected the written measurements and landmarks of the Mexican land grant, and he prevailed. And so when he came back to Sacramento in California, he was still involved with the Natoma Water and Mining Company, but he kind of wanted to get out of that. He really wanted to be an attorney. And so he was getting out of that as the Natoma Company started their encroachment of the Bugbey property. So Bugbey didn't necessarily have an issue with Catlin because Catlin had kind of removed himself by 1870 out of the Natoma Water and Mining Company. He was primarily an attorney in Sacramento and gaining notoriety on that front. And they would both be in the Republican Party. So there was a connection there. Catlin actually worked on the probate of Nettie McClashen's father's property, Peter McClashen. So they kind of knew one another. And but it was Catlin who negotiated the sale of these 9,000 plus acres. And that was a huge, huge amount of land.
A dam at Salmon Falls on the South Fork of the American River, about 15 miles northeast of Sacramento, was completed over the next couple years. The company didn't only supply irrigation water, but power as well. Livermore modeled it on the water wheels he had seen near his home in Lowell, Massachusetts. We've talked a little about ditches in passing, like in episode 24 with the Jackson Experiment Station, which was located just above the Amador Ditch. These were crucial infrastructure improvements in Gold Rush era California. The Natoma Ditch was 8 feet wide at the top, 5 feet wide at the base. It ran for 16 miles and was 3 feet deep. It would have wooden flumes also to help with elevation changes. Construction of the ditch cost $200,000, and they made $40,000 profit after their first year. This was also the same ditch that ran through Bugbey's Natoma vineyard. Catlin and some shareholders decided in 1854 to start a second company located on the North Fork of the American River, the American River Water and Mining Company. The ditch was expanded by 12 miles. This additional income allowed them to purchase 10,000 acres of the Rancho Rio de los Americanos land grant in 1857. Over the next years, court battles would ensue over this purchase. The area was late to be surveyed after California became a state, and patents for the land had to be awarded before it was totally official. Livermore finally took control of the company in 1862. This Livermore family has no relation to the one that started the town of the same name. In fact, they actually started the neighborhood of Rock Ridge in Oakland on land they purchased from the original grantee, the Peralta family. They also own the land where the Claremont Country Club now stands. The state of California and the Natoma Water and Mining Company signed the first convict labor contract on June 30, 1868. The company would get 30,000 days of convict labor in exchange for 350 acres of land on which to build Folsom Prison. The company formed out of this agreement would build the first iteration of the Folsom Dam. In 1892, logging was finally able to start with the aid of the dam, and electricity would follow only a couple years later, successfully sending power 22 miles to Sacramento. 30,000 visitors poured into Sacramento to witness the start of the electrical age for the city, and Folsom became the nation's first prison to have electric lights. Livermore now started to make better use of some of the 8,000 acres of undeveloped land that his company owned. In 1877, he planted 40 acres of tokay vines and 70 to muscat. This was more of a table grape and raisin project at the outset. Unlike Bugbey, their raisins didn't take. Early fall rains doomed the project, but the shipping business boomed. In relation to Bugbey's vineyard, this one was described as, quote, comparatively level. Vines were planted with an 8x8 spacing, and every 200 feet there was a 16-foot wide road. In only 2 years, Zinfandel replaced the muscat. Another 1,000 acres were planted in 1882, all to wine grapes. 400 acres were planted to Folie Blanche, and the rest with newly imported European varieties, including Cinsault, Mondouse, Zinfandel, Aramon, Bastardo, Boal, Matero, Carignan, Semillon, Claret, Verdelho, Petit Boucher, Petit Verdot, Petit Syrah, Grenache, Black Burgundy, Burger, Colombard, Mosel Riesling, Merlot, Beckland, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. Generally getting about 2.5 tons per acre. Peach, pear, and plum trees were planted along the borders. In 1883, another 600 acres went in, and the Natoma Water and Mining Company made a request of the university to conduct experiments in growing and winemaking on the 40 newly imported varieties on their land. The results would be made public in the viticultural reports and bulletins. The Natoma Water Company would supply the casks as well as transportation to and from the vineyards near Folsom. The Agricultural College of the university was seriously underfunded at this time and could only undertake the experiments with the Natoma Company subsidizing much of the cost. Soil samples were taken from various parts of the vineyard. One of the first things the university noted was the reddish soils, much higher in lime, potash, and phosphoric acid than was common. Gravelly loam and stones of various sizes were also noted in the vineyard. The university and Hilgard seemed excited about the new project in the viticultural reports. Quote, "The volume, and in a measure the importance of the work of the season 1884 largely exceeded that of 1883. This was in the main due to the offer of the Natoma Water and Mining Company of Natoma, Sacramento County to forward to the viticultural laboratory for experimental winemaking sample lots of each of about 40 varieties of grapes which had been imported from Europe 2 years before, and having been grafted on vigorous mission stalks and trained long on stakes, were expected to yield a sufficient crop for a fair winemaking test. Some of these would be fruited in the state for the first time." Unquote. In the reports of 1884, we can clearly see the influence the Natoma plantings were having. In Bulletin 23, contributors of grapes were listed for the year. Natoma Water and Mining Company, 22 red, 22 white. H.A. Pellet, St. Helena, 1 red, 0 white. J.L. Block, Livermore, 1 red, 1 white. J.T. Doyle, Mountain View, 1 red, 0 white. William Pfeffer, Gubserville, 3 red, 0 white. H.W. Crabb, Oakville, 2 red, 0 white. This continues on. Pfeffer's 3 was the highest red grape donation besides Natoma. No other donor donated more than 1 white grape variety. The results would serve all vineyardists and winemakers in the state, and even though analysis would tell them much, the final determination would lie with the tasters. Quote, "In the winemaking countries of Europe, this knowledge has been acquired by long experience, and chemical investigation has subsequently, in a great measure, ascertained the natural conditions upon which the attainment of certain results in winemaking depends. The principles thus evolved can be applied to new conditions, such as those existing in California, and thus save to a great extent the laborious and costly experimenting which has been gone through heretofore, by formulating into generally intelligible rules the knowledge which otherwise remains the trade secret of a few experts. It should fully be understood and remembered that while peculiarities and defects shown by analysis are perfectly definite indications as to the conditions that must be fulfilled in a successful blend, yet analysis cannot as yet take cognizance of the delicate and almost intangible flavors or bouquets which must likewise be made to harmonize in order to satisfy a cultivated palate. To that extent, the determination of the proper blends must always remain with the expert wine taster." Unquote. We also see Hilgard here advising vintners to use smaller fermenting vessels, say 2,000 gallon instead of 10,000 gallon. He also makes clear that blending pre-fermentation produces a different wine than the same blend post-fermentation. Quote, "In every case, wine was made of each variety of grapes separately, and each must was analyzed on the day it was pressed. But whenever feasible, blends of several kinds promising good results when so combined were also made prior to fermentation, since in that case the union becomes more perfect, and sometimes the results differ materially from those obtained when the wines ready-made are blended, unquote. The grapes, after arriving in Berkeley from Folsom, usually 2, sometimes 4 days after picking, would be destemmed and crushed. They kept the room a little warmer than usual for these small lots so that fermentation would finish in around 7 to 9 days. Each fermenter of red grapes had a floating, unperforated cover, although a couple inches smaller in diameter than the fermenter. This would be removed and the must punched down and stirred well twice a day. After the ferment went dry, they would press it, and because of the much smaller quantities as the vines were still very young, the press wine would always be combined back with the free run. They had 2 presses, a Keystone and an Americus. The same person always did the pressing, so, as they believed, the amount of tannin and extract in each wine would be consistent with the grape. Analyzation of the finished wine was attempted as soon as possible based on schedule. The plan was that they would be judged against the same grapes grown by John T. Doyle in Cupertino. You probably remember Doyle from episode 26 on the other experiment stations. He had allowed the university to use a couple acres for experiments with over 40 varieties planted. These are the 40 varieties. Despite the assistance from the company, the project overwhelmed the small team at the university. M.E. Jaffa, Hilgard's main assistant, couldn't keep up with all the testing and analysis needed for each sample. This is before the hatch funds were supplied, and the university relied on the goodwill of the industry and growers to a great deal. Mr. Federico Pondorf offered his help. He was a well-known wine expert, mostly working in St. Helena. Pondorf's son would also work with them, and both Pondorfs took on the assignment eagerly. Even still, they were unable to keep up, and the university, on Hilgard's suggestion, hired George E. Colby, first on a temporary, then on a permanent basis. This is one of the moments that would eventually lead to the start of the official experiment stations. Men were working evenings and holidays. As they worked, Pondorf would also attempt blends of multiple wines that might work well together. Remember, many of these were new to California, and some varieties might have never been tasted previously by the men. They end up with 96 samples total to present at the State Viticultural Convention of the next year. The first year they had issues related to the cooperage supplied by Natoma. The staves were too thin. Oxygen was getting in until the university coated them all with a paraffin wax. In 1884, there were 67 varieties tested. 47 came from the Natoma cuttings. This is when we see the university start categorizing grapes based on their known area of origin. Burgundy, Italian, Bordeaux, Southern French, Rhenish, etc. All the grapes being tested in the Natoma vineyard were grafted onto 2-year-old mission rootstock. Pondorf's tasting notes were all over the viticultural reports. Here he is tasting a Tinta Amarella from Natoma in 1885. Quote, "Wine in good condition, a light violet color, and indifferent in character, holding still a large amount of carbonic acid." Unquote. For 1884, the university released Bulletin 37, Investigations of Wine from Rare Grape Varieties, focusing on Cinsault, Petit Bouschet, Verdot, and Merlot. They were impressed with nearly everything about Cinsault except its color. Quote, "On the other hand, the quality of the wine is grand, its flavor and corresponding taste of a high expression, indicative of all that can be desired from a first-class red wine grape." Unquote. They liked it even more when it was blended with some Petit Syrah. Petit Bouschet was found to be, quote, "pretty neutral, but perfectly sound." Unquote. The teinturier properties of the grape, meaning that the flesh was red, also excited them. The large yields, too. Verdot they found interesting in that it ripened much earlier in Folsom than it did in France, preceding the Cinsault, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Beclin, and ripening closer to the time of the Syrah, Cab Franc, and Petit Bouschet. From this, they found interesting that different pre-fermentation or field blends might be possible than were used in the historic home of some of these grapes. Merlot they were somewhat unimpressed with, but also felt like it should be grown on hillsides and sloping ground rather than the relatively flat Natoma property. Another test they took on was comparing the bunch and berry sizes and cluster details with what was common in France. They wanted to know that these grapes had the same qualities and were labeled correctly. They would make notes of any differences. smaller berry size, clusters more tightly packed, that sort of thing. Becklin, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon were three grapes the university built the 1884 Bulletin No. 38 around. Hilgard and the university recommending them all. Quote, being light bearers of fruit with a low yield of must, but producing delicate wines of high quality, the above three varieties will naturally be chosen chiefly by those who make a specialty of high-grade wine. Unquote. Some other notes on Becklin, which they also enjoyed when blended with Petit Boucher. Quote, the color of this wine is a fine ruby hue with great density. Its astringency considerable and well proportioned. Its mild, light, oily, fully vinous expression, placing it on a level in regard to quality with Cinsault. The Becklin partakes of a character midway between Burgundy and Medoc types and may be useful in blends as it is desirable for direct drinking. Unquote. Marsanne, Claret, Roussanne, Petit Syrah, Syrah, Mont Douce were also analyzed in the same ways and released in bulletins from the university. The three white grapes they seemed to have a measured optimism for, while the last three reds they had many good things to say. In 1885, Livermore was forced out as president, and experiments with the university were mostly abandoned. But still over 1,300 acres of wine grapes and 200 of table grapes kept producing. There were over 1.2 million vines in the vineyard by this time. At this point, it's noted that the vineyard is not irrigated except for table grapes. The predominant varieties were now Zinfandel, Black Burgundy, Grenache, Chasse Noire, Trousseau, Berger, Colombard, Charbonneau, Carignan, Mataro, Folie Blanche, and Moselle Riesling. These were large blocks of each as opposed to interplanted. 60 other varieties were also in the vineyard in smaller 10 to 15 acre blocks, or tracts as they were called. 150 men were employed, 100 of them being Chinese laborers. 120 horses were in use for plowing, tilling, and cultivation. This year they shipped 275 tons of table grapes, mostly to New Orleans, Chicago, and St. Louis. It was said to be the second largest vineyard in the state with its 2,000 acres, after only Leland Stanford's massive Vina vineyard in Tehama County in 1886. In 1887, the Natoma Company built its own winery to handle most of its grapes. Vina did the same. Grape prices were at a real low point due to the wine wars. The Natoma winery would hold 300,000 gallons of wine. They could also distill 800 gallons of brandy a day. Despite being put up quickly, it became a powerhouse, guided by C. Henry Schuessler, the plant manager, and David H. Ward, the general manager. Colonel Herman Bendel, a prominent San Francisco merchant, was also a board member. The winery and distilling plant were continually enlarged as more vines came online. The new distillery could do 1,500 gallons of brandy a day. England and Germany were the chief importers of the Natoma brandy. It was always distilled from Folie Blanche and Colombard grapes, and it was said to have a really good reputation. The wines were generally bulk wines sold to merchants in San Francisco, most likely lost in million-gallon blends somewhere. George Hussman, the early Missouri and California wine man, said it was, quote, a most striking illustration of the rapid advance of the viticultural interests in the state, unquote. Henry Palais, whose name we heard earlier, came from the Napa Valley with a good reputation and cemented it when he took over the production. Sweet wine and brandy, or cognac, were both around 100,000 gallons by now. They made history when they were responsible for the largest shipment by a California wine merchant to a foreign port until then. 1,250 full barrels and 1,250 half barrels of port and brandy on its way to Germany. In 1891, a massive shipment of 18,176 gallons of brandy was sent to Bremen, Germany. The Natoma cognac was sold under the Eagle, Crown, and 3-Star names. The 3-Star was actually 3 stars, not a printed name. Colonel Herman Bendel from the board became an officer in the California Winemakers Corporation, or CWMC, in 1894. He sparked most of the interest in it through the trade papers, facing the producers off with the large wine houses. Quote, my idea is that a central organization should at once be formed and put in control of officers who command confidence. Let them be required to give bonds if deemed advisable. Then let the producers bind themselves to give over their crops for sale. And to prevent outside selling by them, they should give an absolute bill of sale. Receiving certification, they are entitled to a proportionate share of the profits arising from the sale, or the profit in excess of this outlay, yearly, by having a wine no matter whose wines are sold by the Central Association, a strong national association to which he can refer all manner of the value of the wine going into the pool is of course determined by the pool experts. The details of the scheme can be worked out afterward, but to ensure success, the grower must not be in a position to sell his wine. He must let the pool attend to that. If this provision is not strictly adhered to and insisted upon, there will be some who will try to sell out at slightly lower figures than demanded by the central organization, and the object of all the work will be defeated." Unquote. He had been promoting the forming of a grower syndicate to battle the rapidly consolidating wine houses. For a while, this worked. 1895 saw them sell 100,000 gallons of sherry to the California Wine Association, or CWA, when the two organizations were cooperating. By 1896, the vineyard and winery were leased to other members of the CWMC. Secretary John Wheeler, the Napa Vineyardists, and Rennie Brothers of St. Helena, under the name Rennie Brothers and Wheeler, expanded the vineyard to nearly 500,000 gallons, but couldn't quite make the numbers work. In 1900, the California Wine Association would lease the Natoma vineyard for 5 years, diverting its crop from Lachman and Jacoby. 200,000 gallons of sweet wine were purchased at an advanced price, as they used to say, meaning high. The amount was so high that Lachman and Jacoby allowed it to go through. At this point, they owned 2/5 of the vineyard, and Theodore Kearney and Louis Drexel owned the other 3/5. After the sale, the CWA purchased that 3/5 share. Kohler and Froling, another CWA-associated firm, came to own a share in the vineyard as well. We will learn how this all worked in an upcoming episode. For the 1900 vintage, 5 severe frosts ruined over 50% of the crop from the area. The heat of the winery was an issue for the CWA. They installed cold storage and cooling features for fermentations in the cellars. It worked a little bit, but they still felt like it couldn't be depended on for their finer wines. Shortly before 8 p.m. on September 13, 1904, engineer of the winery and distillery, Mr. Lester, was walking through the distillery, candle in hand, to inspect tanks of high-proof brandy. The last few days had been hot ones, and alcohol vapor swirled in the room. The candle caused an explosion and then fire. Mr. Lester was severely burned and then injured further when he fell into the engine room in the story below. The entire facility was destroyed after flames spread to the winery as well. A loss of probably about $200,000 in the infrastructure, wine, and brandy. It was quickly rebuilt as one of the most modern wineries at a cost of $75,000, and the CWA extended their lease. There were rumors in November 1904 that the vineyard had been sold to the Guggenheim family for $2 million, or $500 per acre, but it ended up being false. In 1906, R.G. Hanford organized the Natoma Development Company. Its first purchase was the Natoma Vineyard, along with the winery, all for $600,000. They also scooped up other ranches lying adjacent to the vineyard, as well as the nearby 128-acre Cordova vineyard owned by the California Winery in Sacramento. Although ostensibly a real estate company, the plan was to dredge much of the land. A clause in the contract stated that until it was fully paid off, for every acre of vines the development company dug up, 2 would have to be planted. This clause, as well as the CWA's lease on the property, gave the vineyard a slight reprieve. W.H. Hammond, the so-called, quote, California Dredge King, unquote, was a principal shareholder in the company. He didn't really want the vineyard, preferring uncultivated land he could more easily dredge. There seemed to be palpable sadness in the papers that is rare to find at this time as they wrote about the Hammond takeover, complimenting the vineyard and winery. Quote, "The Natoma Winery is one of the largest and best plants in the state, and every year thousands of gallons of the finest kinds of wines are manufactured there." Unquote. And writing about dredging. Quote, "The dredging operations put much money into circulation, but the land is left piled with heaps of cobbles and does not fit for any purpose whatever after the dredge has passed over it." Unquote. The water rights and ditches would go with it. It was known there was gold on the land, and only a matter of time until the vineyard would be gone. It was like a last little touch of the Gilded Age for Sacramento. Quote, "The gold dredger kings of the Sacramento Valley have their clutch upon the Natoma vineyard and propose to turn it into a pile of barren cobblestones for the gold that can be got from it. The proposal has shocked the Sacramento Valley, where the opposition to gold dredging had begun to lag from familiarity." Unquote. And another one, quote, "California's best wealth is not the gold that can be extracted from her soil, but lies in the power of the soil to permanently support the race. For the immediate nickel, then, the dredges are sacrificing the lasting prosperity of the state." Unquote. The winery started up with harvest the first week of September 1907. An unusually large crop was hanging, and it seemed like it would be a long season. The improvements after the fire were working well. They would pack their table grapes to ship east here also. Despite the new ownership, nothing was substantially different for the day-to-day work of running a winery. In 1909, more gold was discovered on the land. The dredging machines moved in, tearing up vineyard and leaving bare land and thousands of tailing rows. The winery was later converted to a cannery.
Machinery was finally getting large enough to handle some of the massive work required to dredge. And many men wanted to do this, and there were dredges along some of the rivers, but they were much smaller than what was necessary to prosecute this land south of the American River under in the ownership of the Natoma Company. But when those finally started to come online at the turn of the century, it was the vines are gone and the dredges come in, and they went down as far as they could, and they would flood different areas, and the dredge pilings, just all over south of the American River. It's just kind of crazy, the destruction to the landscape that happened during the dredges. But even, the landscape was fairly destroyed with some of the other gold mining along the American rivers. You couldn't see the destruction underground because those were, tunnels. But above ground, the dredging was just really nasty. I guess some people, I'm not sure. I mean, that's what they see now. They see this pilings, and it reminds them of the gold mining days. But that really was post 1850. Just tore up all that land out there. It was a strip mine. Yeah. I mean, it was essentially a strip mine. The only way it has recovered is recovered isn't the right word. To erase most of it is when it was put into homes. Is that erasing it? Is that making it better? I don't know, but it could never go back to the way it was, because there were orchards and vineyards. Sometimes on this history stuff, people take some of this stuff and glorify it and romanticize it. And look at these big dredges. Oh, wasn't this cool? And yes, I'm the first little kid to be excited about big things that move and create steam and stuff like that. But there is another side. There's another story. And there were lots of farms down there. There was a book started in 1880, a journal of the Natoma Water Mining Company, and there were maps in there of the different farms, some of them Chinese, that they were selling water to. And of course, all of those were gone because I think they were just leasing the property to them as the dredges came in and whatnot. So it displaced a lot of those people. But yeah, so I think that story needs to be told. You're absolutely correct. Not everyone was excited and in favor of these huge dredges coming in and really forever changing the landscape as we know it.
It's estimated $100 million worth of gold was extracted from the fields of the Natoma vineyard and the surrounding area, all the way up until 1962. The dredge tailings can still be seen in some areas. Others are covered by housing or have been used as orange groves, or to test rocket engines, or gravel mining. There are very few uses for this land, and much of it looks no different than when the dredges stopped.
And that's kind of the interesting thing about history is, especially if you can visit those places, it's like, this person was here, this happened here, and making connections and whatnot. And Folsom, they've done a pretty good job of trying to retain a lot of the historic nature of it. Some things they've obliterated. And then the Bureau of Reclamation now, and where you can get around Folsom Lake is controlled by state parks. And so they don't really want to talk a lot about history. They don't really want to. You can go and see the basement of Benjamin Norton Bugbey's house, but there are no signs there because they just don't want people to know about it. So they don't want to notice any historical structures because there's all kinds of different laws around that and whatnot. And they've done some different surveys out there. And it always surprised me. I mean, the Natoma ditch and the North Fork ditch are, it is quintessential early California gold rush history that should be on some sort of list somewhere, but it's like, no, never happened.
Thanks for listening today. Obviously, the two vineyards had very different paths despite sharing a name. I'm thankful for Kevin for getting me straightened out with that confusion. The larger and later Natoma Vineyard had been on my mind for some time because you see so much of it in the early university writings and as a source for CWA and in other periodicals, and then it just vanished. Professor Hilgard is someone, of course, we keep returning to. If you haven't heard episode 24 or 26, those give you the background to what he's doing with the university, why he's doing it, and why we should care about it today. Bugbey, I quite honestly had no idea about before running across Kevin's work, but you look back through sources and his name is sprinkled in there plenty. I love that Kevin gave us so much great background about the 49ers and sort of this other way of looking at the early winemaking in California as it becomes kind of professionalized. How they learned, how they exchanged information, and crazy things they might have tried, like Bugbey's heating of his wines. You can find Kevin's books on Amazon. You can also find his writings and history of the American River and Greater Sacramento area on his website, insuremekevin.com. His Instagram is insuremekevin also. There are links to all those in the show notes. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast, and feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also a Patreon if you choose to support the podcast monetarily to allow for more episodes and to help defray other costs. Any amount is appreciated. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.